Okay, I think we're going to get started now. Welcome everyone. Appreciate you joining. Good morning, good afternoon to wherever you are, and thanks for taking your time out of your day to join us for this presentation of mobility in the time of COVID-19. As you know, the Media Lab has been working diligently on a number of different industry category presentations around various trends and how those have accelerated during the time of coronavirus, and what we can expect and out of some of these shifts in the consumer and industry behaviors as they tend to stick around for the short term and through quarantine and into the recovery stages and post-COVID and beyond. Today, as I mentioned, I'll be discussing mobility. This was originally focused on the automotive and fuel sectors, but I've kind of expanded that to include other areas as well as we've received feedback from within the business. I want to quickly recognize Adam Simon, who's the head of strategy for the lab, who's also on the line acting as moderator and producer for this stream. During the course of the presentation, Adam will be fielding questions in the Q&A Teams chat. So if you have anything that you want us to go back on or have any questions about some of the content, feel free to post in there. I will be pausing periodically throughout the presentation to field some of those and answer some of those as best we can. But I think we are good. Other than the fact that I haven't introduced myself, my name is Sean Ahern. I'm a senior manager at the client services at the lab. And I think that about covers it. So without further ado, we can jump in and get started. Before we take a deeper dive into the mobility sector specifically, we want to highlight some of the more macro trends that we're seeing across several sectors in the industry as a result of COVID. So the first being that we want to reiterate that the pandemic we're seeing as a trend accelerator. So the macro trend number one that we're seeing is businesses being pushed into the digital age. Even those who may have been resistant up to now to make that switch are kind of being forced to do so. One of the callouts that we'll definitely talk about later is in the auto manufacturing sector, where we're seeing a switch to digital platforms and online sales platforms to reach consumers, as well as offering at-home test drives. In the grocery sector, we're seeing a lot of adoption of click and collect platforms. If you happen to miss Ben Hohn's presentation yesterday on the retail industry and the impacts there, I would highly suggest taking a look. That will be available to share out, and he goes into more detail there. And also on the telemedicine side, we're seeing a lot of the regulatory relaxation on HIPAA compliancy, giving more people access and democratizing care during those quarantine measures. So important to point out in all of this that as consumers become more accustomed to these services, industries may find it difficult to revert back to some of their previous and traditional formats. Additionally, we're seeing the rise of the at-home economy. So meaning we're seeing service-based workers almost transforming into influencers and internet authorities overnight. A lot of them are producing how-to content, offering virtual lessons and trainings in the absence of that foot traffic to physical locations. So people like chefs and barbers, personal trainers and otherwise are entering this virtual world to showcase their skills and in some cases actually monetize that. Media disruption is another macro trend that we're seeing. Obviously, this audience today is probably very familiar with that. But because of shelter-in-place guidance and ordinances is completely transformed the way people are consuming their media and many of our preconceived notions about reaching audiences. So media companies are quickly pivoting and moving content over to digital platforms and formats as they try to adapt, which is leading to a huge bump in the streaming sector. And we're actually seeing a 77% year-over-year increase during prime time in streaming. Another trend, or probably just more so a fixture of reality, is the economic downturn that we're all experiencing. So despite the $2 trillion sum stimulus package, it does seem inevitable that we're facing sort of a long-term, prolonged recession. Particularly notable is the number of unemployed workers that has spiked, which has been widely documented. as in this New York Times article here. This will impact the types of products and the services and behaviors that consumers participate in the long term, for sure. And another important call out is that there seems to be a very acute sense of consumers monitoring brands' response to COVID-19, how they are demonstrating corporate social responsibility and pivoting their businesses to become part of the solution, whether that's altering supply chains, which we'll talk a little bit more about today, or just spreading awareness via social. This is definitely going to have a long-lasting impact on a consumers' perceptions of these brands during the pandemic. This is an interesting screenshot here of a website called Did They Help, where it's literally a search engine. You can put in a company and or a celebrity and find out what their contributions to the cause have been. So it's important because per an Edelman survey, about 2/3 of customers believe that brands' response to COVID will have an impact on their likelihood to use or purchase that brand later on. So that's the overview, and we'll now sort of dive into the impact of the mobility sector specifically. So the mobility industry has inescapably been impacted by the global pandemic. In the near term, we're seeing global supply chain woes, volatile markets, social distance and quarantine measures. Those are just several but temporary hurdles that we'll have to overcome. And in the next section, we'll explore how the different corners of this sector, from automotive to trucking to aviation, and a bit about fuel, the challenges that they're facing specifically, and some of the pivots that they've made in the short term. Beginning with the auto industry. So one of the early hits to the industry were widespread factory closures. I think that was kind of like the oh no moment for automotive. But as quarantine measures have taken hold, auto sales in the US and abroad have declined, and forecasts are suggesting that this trend will continue under quarantine advisories. So ALG, which is a TrueCar subsidiary, projects the US new vehicle sales to fall by as many as 2.4 million units from 2019. We have an interesting chart here that showcased what it could have been like to have a quick recovery. I'd say we're probably sort of leaning towards the long-term economic slowdown from this point on. But as a benchmark, looking back on some data, China actually saw a 92% decrease in auto sales for the first half of February. Important to keep in mind that that was also part of the Chinese New Year period, but still a pretty startling statistic. However, as China is a little bit ahead of us in their process for recovery, and we're really in uncharted territory here, many economists and industry experts have been looking to them as a case study for global recovery. A recent Bloomberg report indicated that car sales had actually bounced back pretty quickly after the restrictions were lifted, which was around April 3rd, when about 99% of China's auto showrooms were back in business. And at that point, consumer traffic was running at about 66% of normal levels. What's interesting is the anecdotal behavior that we're hearing out of the dealerships there, who are saying that consumers are trying to be more health conscious and purchasing vehicles because they see it as a healthy alternative to public transit. So it'll be interesting to see if that translates into the US market as well. Important to keep in mind that this is also being seen as a response to a paralyzed economy. So while it's a nice uptick, chances are it will gradually plateau. We're beyond economic projections. We're also seeing a decline in the US auto sales search inquiries. While most of these that you see on this chart below from Google Trends are brands outside of the US, the trend remains the same for the big three US auto manufacturers as well. And at the end of 2019 and the top of 2020, a major trend that we were hearing about in the auto industry was a heavy push towards electric vehicle manufacturing. Despite those announcements, these moves are expected to push pause, at least temporarily. And the rationale is, the market's heavily reliant on global sourcing for the core components, which is the battery, which has obviously come with some obstacles. The sector is still in its youth in terms of the consumer adoption, and additionally, these vehicles often are still priced at a premium, even with the federal tax credits. So for now, consumers might be more likely to tighten their belts and focus on maybe a hybrid model or a traditional gas model. But again, this is a pause. Even as early as this week, Wall Street is promoting and showing strong support for long-term electric vehicle adoption. Goldman Sachs produced a report estimating 15% growth in the EV vehicle penetration by 2030. To complicate things in mobility and electric vehicles a bit further, we're definitely witnessing the fallout in the oil industry of a confluence of factors. We have a recently resolved price war, but general low demand for crude in the face of quarantine measures. April estimates from an International Energy Agency report that came out this week say global oil demand is expected to fall by about 9.3 million barrels per day year on year. So it's a pretty heavy hit. And even though gasoline prices have fallen, the consumers are trapped at home and not really at a position to take advantage of that. And while we were hopeful that that deal that was inked in OPEC was going to help, it doesn't seem like it's enough to be on par with the demand drop. So this ripple effect is being felt, of course, at the station level. U.S. gas station operators are showing the same store gasoline sales were down 2.4% for the week ending in March, with further declines expected through April. We see similar things out of the West Coast and Northeast region in their sales. These were sort of the canaries in the coal mine early on in the pandemic. But in the West Coast, demand volumes were down 8.4% in the early days compared to 2019, and in the Northeast region about down 3.7%. These folks are expecting losses on the year of about 20 to 40% overall. But according to data from GasBuddy, which is a travel and navigation app that has about 90 million downloads, what it does is it helps North American drivers discover fuel-saving opportunities and leading them to certain stations. For the month of March, year over year, they saw a 14% decline in fuel transactions and a 20% decline in fuel pumped. In these periods, we have seen percent increases for the most part. But what I thought was a particularly interesting consumer behavior was when people are filling up and the hours of the day. So the chart that you see here is indicative of when the volume of sales is occurring, and it happens on Fridays. And the purchases are happening between 4 and 7 p.m. typically. So most of the quarantine measures took hold at the end of Q1, so it will be interesting to see if these behaviors follow through to Q2, even as demand is lower. On the commercial transportation front, the industry as a whole, we've obviously seen buses, maritime aviation is all down across North America and the globe. However, the trucking industry, and particularly the heavy-duty trucking data, shows that load volumes seem to be less impacted and more consistent to pre-pandemic baseline volumes. And this is especially observing fuel fill-ups. The trucking industry has been quite steady, which equates to the consistent, if not increased, demand for transportations and the logistics sector, especially now as we're seeing a lot of emergency supplies and products and grocery needs being carried across the country and need for replenishment. And in the early days so far, we've seen that spot rates, that is the cost to hire a last-minute truck on the open market, have actually jumped to 6.1% since late February. This is an interesting chart from Geotab, which is a freight analytics and insights tool and consortium showing weight class fueling percent of normal volume. So just to further illustrate, in the heavy duty trucking, it's a little bit down. It's still staying relatively consistent at the top of this chart versus some of the light duty trucking or passenger or bus vehicles here. On the airline side, the global airline industry has been widely covered by the media. It's perhaps one of the hardest hit mobility sectors by immediacy. Analysis from Forbes indicates that ticket sales have plummeted in the hardest hit global regions. At one time in Italy, it was down 80% at times. I think the total US air travel had 90,000 people this Wednesday, even checking into TSA. So unless the virus is effectively contained within the next couple of months, we expect the depressed demand environment and reduced global revenue to persist well into 2021. And fleet sizes are expected to decline over 20% by the end of May in the hardest hit regions as well. On the cargo side for the air industry, similar to trucking, the airline industry is also facing strains on cargo and shipping. So data from Accenture and Seabury shows all the trade lanes across the world are seeing double-digit air cargo capacity declines compared to last year, particularly in the Trans-Pacific and Asia-Pacific to Europe. They're seeing the smallest declines relative to other trade lines. But with widespread travel bans now grounding most of our global passenger fleets, which is removing about 60% of the air cargo capacity from the market, the task of keeping these vital supply chains moving has fallen on the air cargo industry alone. So interesting chart here. The notes is that the thickness of the arrows is representative of the capacity in metric tons. So you can see where most of those flights are occurring in the drops. For the maritime sector and the shipping sector, analysis is illustrated that how reliant the global market is on the Chinese marine shipping business. So ban on non-essential travel, reduction of workforce, and closure of some of those shipbuilding facilities have had significant impacts on the sector, which in the marine world boils down to tanker, capesize, and container. But back in January, the impact seemed relatively small as it came during the Chinese New Year. And the industry had sort of already prepared for that drop. But this, of course, deteriorated as the Chinese New Year was extended and into the later months with quarantine measures. Figures from the Shanghai International Shipping Institute indicate that during the apex of China's outbreak, the shutdown from January to February saw a reduced capacity utilization of about 20 to 50%, the biggest ports. But more good news relative out of China as we're looking to them once again. The April reports show signs of a slow recovery in the container shipping as demands appear to recover. China's reopening their shipping routes, and other ports in the hardest hit parts of the world are continuing to operate, albeit under restricting circumstances. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how these sectors and the impacts have caused these different areas to pivot. So while the economic maturities, again, are very different when comparing the US to China, many market experts and economists are keeping a careful eye there to see what lessons and insights can be learned. But before taking that too far ahead view, brands have had to shift priorities today in the midst of declining sales and demand and interest. And brands are taking more of a nobler cause, focusing on the crisis at hand and how they can be part of the solution. So particularly on the automotive side, we see brands have adjusted their manufacturing supply to provide much needed medical equipment. They've jumped headfirst into the national conversation for prevention and care. And we see Ford, GM, and Tesla all stepping up to make ventilators and other types of PPE. These companies are expected to waive profits, but it secures continued employment for their staff at a time when many of them would have otherwise shut down production. Brands are entering the global conversation in the virtual world as well. We're seeing auto brands come through in their social channels, both organically and more recently in paid posts as well. Audi and VW revised their logos to promote social distancing. We have examples here from Lexus and Mercedes-Benz and BMW. So brands would be wise to jump into this conversation as we remember and call back to that Edelman survey. People are taking notice about how people respond or how corporations respond. Beyond just the social space, we're also seeing brands, other brands offering products and services or extra services tailored to financial counseling. So these are just a couple examples of major automakers, but offering deferred payments, giving complimentary Wi-Fi or OnStar for a period of time, or even offering to make certain payments, such as the Ford's Built to Lend a Hand program where they'll actually pay for 3 payments and then you can defer further. On the trucking industry side, supply chain disruptions nationwide and emergency needs are causing a strain, particularly for dispatchers and drivers who are working longer hours while hauling these loads. The Department of Transportation has notably suspended certain regulations requiring off-road brakes for those who are shipping emergency supplies. They still have to take breaks post-delivery, but it's allowing things to move a little bit more quickly. Though the demand is high at present, fulfillment and loading centers are still facing shortages in staff due to the same COVID challenges, so delays are inevitable. But while there's a noticeable uptick in the short term, there is an expectation that the future of the 2020 will still be rocky as demands slow from the initial spikes and the panic buying and the need for immediate replenishment. The airline industry received approximately $50 billion from latest federal stimulus, which is great, but maybe not enough. So as other shipping and commercial industries have done, we're seeing airlines pivot to support the fight against the global crisis. Brands like Boeing and Delta creating face shields. American Airlines is transporting critical supplies for cargo-only flights. Delta is donating 200,000 pounds of non-perishable food. So again, they're entering the conversation as well. Notably, gas stations in the US and abroad are closely linked to convenience stores. So in the United States, 93% of Americans live within just a few minutes of one, and out of every 3 stores in America, there is a convenience store. And most of them sell fuel. About 80% of convenience stores in the US are also gas stations. So in the fuel sector, as the public's demand for fuel is down with shelter-in-place restrictions, gasoline retailers are pivoting their businesses to become more of fill-in stops when those local and big box grocery stores are running low on supply. This is an older figure, but in 2018, more than 60% of convenience store sales came from fuel, according to the National Association of Convenience Stores. So the result of these changes is that while sales at convenience stores still rose in March, they grow more slowly than average over the past year. But research from UM's WAVE study has also indicated that people are less likely to avoid these locations as they are considered essential businesses. So I'm going to take a pause for a moment before we sort of launch into our first innovation territory here to take any questions from that overview section.
No questions so far.
All right, so we'll now begin discussing the trends that we've been watching closely and the potential for acceleration in COVID and a post-COVID world. Starting with purchase and payments and services. So with a decline in more face-to-face interaction and less foot traffic to physical brick and mortar locations, there's a really huge opportunity for retailers and manufacturers to lean into the app, online or digital sales platforms. As it relates to the automotive sector, this is data from Foursquare that's illustrating about a 7% decrease in foot traffic to dealerships. This was in the early to mid part of March as consumers began to quarantine in major metropolitan areas. Obviously now, when we're more in lockdown stages, this has definitely declined further, if not completely stagnated. But now more than ever is sort of the time to digitize the auto buying experience, as we're seeing an explosion on the e-commerce side. Under these conditions, we've seen a drastic rise as people settle into this new normal, and this data from MRCs and Good Data shows the year-over-year growth trends in online transactions by region. So clearly very high, in some cases over 150% increase year over year. Further data indicated that US e-commerce spending continues to surge in the face of COVID-19, with at least 57% growth in revenue and 45% growth in orders for the end of March. So from the automotive perspective, we see the digital auto online sales platforms as ripe for acceleration. Although these platforms trends began with the purpose of appealing to a more millennial consumer, this will now have more cross-generational appeal. And it's an area that many OEMs have begun to explore, but may now need to pivot more confidently, particularly on the dealership side. This is an interesting stat from Frost & Sullivan that estimated approximately 825,000 new vehicles were sold online globally in 2019. And by 2025, that number would be 6 million. This was a pre-COVID figure, so it would be safe to say that that number might happen sooner rather than 5 years from now. Today, almost every car or major car manufacturer has created a version of an online sales platform, either through their official websites or through a partner in order to sell directly or through dealerships. So those brands include BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Jaguar, Land Rover, a lot of them that you see here. This, of course, isn't the full picture, but it just gives you an idea of who's involved. However, the seamlessness of and personalized experience is possible only when with the participations of the dealerships, who are able to adjust vehicle pricing based on the existing demand and the inventory. So digital retail platforms have started to sprout up, like G-Force is, Roadster, and Fastlane, that are helping dealerships digitize their platform and providing potential customers 24/7 access to purchasing vehicles online or generating new leads there. And also even Amazon has entered into this conversation. You can now be connected to dealerships via Amazon to purchase automobiles as well. In direct response to COVID, there are some brands that are building out their digital services. So several dealership chains such as AutoNation and Sonic Automotive are pushing online retail services and home visits where possible, as well as new website features. FCA is partnering with dealerships to improve online tools for getting financing approved over the internet and also configuring order cars from home. And GM is expanding its Shop, Click, and Drive program for trade-in pricing estimates as well as financing. And in the early part of March, GM noticed an uptick in customer shopping for new and used Chevrolets via their portal, an increase of about 30%. So it's definitely, people are definitely interacting with these portals and seeing what they're all about. But as the duration of quarantine remains somewhat unknown, it would be prudent for some auto brands to continue to invest in these services and support dealers to produce these streams. Shares in online dealership portals like CarMax and Coport and Carvana also surged in the later weeks of March. They're down-ish now again in some cases, but I think the idea was that some investors saw them a bit insulated from the storm, especially as a car delivery and contactless purchase is a trend that could take a greater foothold in the post-pandemic world, where people are less likely to go to brick and mortar or locations and socialize there. And we're seeing several brands, I know we talked about this already in terms of the delivery, but others are leaning into home delivery and pickup services as well. So, and many already had these services, such as Audi, they had home delivery already, and they're continuing that. FCA, we've already mentioned. This screenshot here is from Lincoln's Home is Your Sanctuary Spot. Anecdotally, this one just stuck out to me in particular, but it emphasizes the importance of home more than ever and touts their remote purchase and delivery program as well. Continuing on the trend of seamless experiences in the digital space, we've already seen many industries disrupted by the subscription model, which includes auto. The vehicle subscription model was already changing how customers flip between cars and make payments via the app. Pre-COVID estimates had suggested that by 2025, 26, the vehicle subscription programs could account for nearly 10% of all vehicle sales in US and Europe. The increase of digital purchasing and online formats could accelerate that model and those figures as a broader audience is made aware of the opportunity. An interesting hypothesis is that after all this is done and people are out in the world and looking for experiences, the option to change your vehicle with relative ease, and that's somewhat exciting, could be appealing to a post-quarantine population. Pumping station and convenience stores are also capitalizing on the shift to contactless purchase and interaction, and we're likely to see a variety of disruption in the years ahead. So according to YPro, more than 85% of gasoline sold in the US is now at self-service gas stations, and most of them have touchscreen devices and mobile apps. In a post-COVID world, we're likely to see a preference for more payment through a personal mobile device rather than touching communal surfaces. And we have a few brands that have already taken steps in this direction. Exxon and Amazon, of course, partnering for the Alexa Pay Gas feature, which was due to be installed in about 11,000 stations this year. Shell also has a payment and loyalty rewards app. Carpe Diem, which is pictured here, is a European mobile payment solution that partners directly with several stations. So while a lot of these still require you to get out and pump your gas in most states, it's still less direct contact with the communal surface and the customer over at the next stall as well. So in a post-COVID world, there's still a preference for distancing. This is a benefit to lean into on the forecourt. But there are other ways that we might see fueling stations accelerate during this period. So as mentioned earlier, we're now seeing stations lean into their C-store services to blunt the impact of declining sales. And while fuel demand will eventually return, vehicles continue to become more efficient, less gas dependent, and require less stops. So many stations could use this opportunity to future-proof or broaden their offerings and add cross-category services such as gaming, leisure, entertainment, or maybe even offer their location as a convenient pickup site. So the fuel station of tomorrow is likely to be one built on experience beyond just the utility. As an example, Shell, they're kind of experimenting with this in Bangkok, where customers can go to VIP premium service stations and have their vehicle filled by attendants while also enjoying a luxury cafe experience. And just to point there that Shell sells around 60 million cups of coffee at its filling stations. And while the electric vehicle rise might be pushed pause in the short term, we don't expect this to be a long-term hold. So later on in this presentation, we'll discuss the acceleration of autonomous vehicle technology. We expect those technologies, particularly in the delivery space, to become more of a mainstay in a post-pandemic world. These vehicles will definitely need recharging, and it could accelerate diversification of fuel offerings more quickly to become part of the infrastructure. And then just a quick stat from Statista: in March of 2020, the US had approximately 78,500 charging outlets and 25,000 charging stations for plug-in EVs. A big component of the adoption issues with EVs is sort of a uniform process for charging stations and infrastructure. So that is something that we could see come to the fold as well. And another disruptor to the fuel industry, we have mobile fueling apps. They may also get a share of the spotlight. These are considered the Uber for gas on-demand fueling apps, like WeFuel, Filled, Yoshi. Pictured here is one called Booster. A lot of these companies have raised millions in funding over recent years because they offer contactless, convenient service, which could be appealing post-COVID. In the US, a hurdle for these groups is getting around current regulatory standards for the purchase and distribution of gasoline. But there have been some recent victories, particularly with Booster. The city of Dallas and Washington just reshaped their legislation to support them as an essential service. So this could be great for someone who is the disabled community, or maybe someone who just doesn't even want to go to a gas station directly to use those communal services. But the reality is that the demand is still low. And these are very localized services. They're not on a national scale quite yet. So the opportunity to actually take advantage is slim. So I'll take a pause after that section on the purchasing and payments to see if there are any questions.
Still good to go.
All right. So we'll continue on. So as we further consider the preference for less public transit, it's also worth noting how COVID could disrupt and accelerate a preference for ride sharing or micro mobility. Starting on the micro mobility side, according to reporting from Next City, in early March, there was a noticeable surge in bike share ridership in cities like New York and Philadelphia, as commuters looked to avoid the public transit as best they could. Those numbers obviously have since dropped with further quarantine restrictions, but post-COVID could be a different story. So we're seeing out of Beijing that they've, right after the restrictions were lifted, about 187% increase in bike share usage, which is extremely high. So it's worth noting also that in US cities, streets that were normally open to car traffic have been closed and reserved for bikes and scooters, and a lot of these businesses that surround these categories are being seen as essential services and remaining open. So though riders may be reluctant to use public transit, e-scooters and bikes can help individuals ease back into life. In the short term, though, on the micromobility side, they are experiencing struggles financially, as seen with brands like Bird and Lime. Many of these companies were already in a startup phase, and the financial toll of quarantine measures has led to some layoffs. However, even in these more difficult times, we're also seeing micromobility sharing services lean in to support medical professionals and public servants with their services. So a lot of them are offering free access to their scooters for first responders, medical professionals, donating any proceeds. So again, leaning into that corporate social responsibility. And what of the ride-sharing companies? So in the short term, we're seeing a major hit to the gig worker economy and on-demand ride-sharing services. And while there was a small victory recently with the gig workers qualifying for the stimulus bill under the contractor status, there's still a lot up for debate there. Many workers, due to lack of demand and for safety, are getting off the road, at least for ride hailing, or switching to delivery services, which have noticeably increased. But the on-demand service system functions well in a strong economy, but it's unclear how consumers will respond post-pandemic. Experts are assuming that a decrease in discretionary spending as consumers sort of brace for some tighter times in a recession would mean less travel and less rides. However, if we continue to see a trend in the avoidance of mass transit, desire for contactless experience, and an acceleration into autonomous vehicles, which we'll talk about shortly, we could conclude that there might inevitably be more AVs on the road with no drivers. The benefit will be to the consumers as costs are driven down, but that shift seems several years out, at least for passenger vehicles. But maybe, rideshare companies like Lyft or Uber might be wise to use this experience to question their models and push more towards some of that AV testing. On the trucking side, so with demand for truckers certainly in certain sectors very low, and more independent freight haulers seeking employment, we're likely to see an acceleration in the usage of freight brokerage apps. So companies like Convoy, Transfix, and Uber Freight, which is pictured here, they use algorithms to match carriers and loads based on origin, destination, type of load, and timing. The benefit of these platforms is that it increases booking speeds, but it's also a benefit to the shipper because it provides an extremely transparent line of sight into the data and analytics of the logistics. So a lot of shippers are preferring these methods as well. Frost & Sullivan estimated that the digital brokerage market to reach $54.2 billion by 2025. So that was, again, a pre-pandemic estimate, so we might see some acceleration there. Still, this digital freight market has a reputation of being highly saturated. Perhaps this acceleration could identify a leader in the pack, and by a lot of accounts, people are sort of seeing Uber as that leader and emerging as the clear front runner here. As a stat, they have about 50,000 carriers and more than 500,000 trucks and more than 1 million downloads of the app currently. So that is the micromobility and ride-sharing sector. I'll take another pause there very quickly.
Looks like we're still good to go.
Great. So we'll go into our next section, which is automation. So this is an area where we anticipate accelerated growth, both on the manufacturing of automobiles and transportation, as well as the services as a whole. So as factories have shuttered their doors in an effort to protect workers and the greater populations and slow the spread of the virus, output obviously has inevitably stalled. While the priority for now remains to protect employee jobs, it unavoidably raises questions about the long-term impact of automation's place in the future of production. There's an interesting quote here from Brookings. It says robots' infiltration into the workforce doesn't occur at a steady, gradual pace. Instead, automation happens in bursts, concentrated in especially bad times, such as the wake of economic shocks. They also did an automation potential study across industry verticals and indicated that manufacturing and transportation and warehousing were respectively two of the highest industry groups that were susceptible for automation, as well as some other tangential groups like accommodation and food industries that will likely require transportation and warehousing. So outside of the factory, we're seeing autonomous vehicles have their moment in the spotlight. Autonomous delivery robots and robo-taxis have natural appeal in a world that prefers contactless interaction, and startups are really using this climate as a proving ground for their tech. One of those startups is Neolix. So in China, in the past few months, as manufacturers look for driverless delivery systems that would be useful in pandemic situations, that Neolix has sort of jumped out to the forefront as one of those autonomous delivery vehicles, and it was one of the first to market. So their vans have delivered medical supplies, supplemented labor shortages in the areas hardest hit by COVID-19. And some of the e-commerce retailers are taking notice, and they actually saw a 60% increase in orders of their vehicles from sites such as Alibaba and JD. Those purchases were also spurred on by the Chinese government offer to subsidize a lot of that cost. So Neolix anticipates to bring sales to about 1,000 vans by the end of the year. Closer to home, we have the Neuro R2 pictured here, as well as other bots like the Kiwi bot and Starship Technologies. So they're very similar in form and function, and they exclusively deliver groceries or other essential. Notably, federal regulations in the US are also relaxing restrictions on these particular types of vehicles so they can get out on the road and offer their services. As they're typically more smaller, they go slower, they're more of a sidewalk companion. There's less danger surrounding the overall utilization. So they're expanding very rapidly. For instance, Starship Technologies has expanded to several West Coast cities and is actively delivering services and goods, and plans to be in 100 university campuses by 2021. Robo-taxis and autonomous passenger vehicles could also see a bit of a renaissance in the post-COVID world, with less people commuting to work. We're already seeing, again, public transit is taking a hit severely, but post-COVID, maybe there would be more of a adoption and of a work from home policy. But in the New York City subway, ridership is extremely down, as is in most metropolitan areas. But this is being seen as an opportunity for automakers as they anticipate consumers to continue to avoid that public transit. So in the short term, most of the autonomous vehicle testing has been halted for safety reasons. But again, in a climate of social distancing, it's easy to see the appeal of a driverless vehicle. AV taxis naturally aid in the stifling of any sort of spread of diseases, and companies are building these fleets of these vehicles that are already taking steps on the sanitization side and cleaning side, and building that into their process and procedures. We're seeing other startups offer a bit more ambitious opportunities in this space, and particularly with sensor monitoring. So this is Vayyar. They're an Israeli-based startup. They're looking to the future of AVs and vehicle tech and seeing the possible application for the next pandemic. They've developed technology that enables passenger breathing monitoring and e-calling and vital sign recording and much more. So we could see a future of AV ambulances of sorts, so the healthcare centers on wheels that'll use biometric sensors to review patient vitals and make critical diagnoses in transit. And this could even be an offering in your own personal vehicle to understand who's been in it, who's not well, which may be comforting to some consumers. But whatever the applications may be, there's clear appeal to the idea of a smarter, healthy, integrated auto. And of the EVs, we saw very many automakers show up in the EV category this year at CES. Ford Mach-E, Nissan, Fisker Ocean, plug-in Jeeps. So while automakers might scale back on some of the ambitions in the short term, they'd be wise to continue those investments even through these more challenging times. We've definitely noticed as a unintended benefit, I guess you could say, is the impact that the quarantine procedures have had on the environment. So through weather mapping and social media, the world has been able to really see the direct effects of lower emissions on the ecosystem, things like the Venice canals clearing, these images that you see here of China and Italy's emission levels decreasing. So there could be a post-COVID further energy to the climate change movement to bring on a greater demand for these class of vehicle. On the maritime side, the story is very similar with automation. So leaders are seeing the shipping sector will lead into the digital automation and innovation out of necessity to the industry to be more resilient in the future. So increase in investment in digital freight technologies, leaning back to the trucking, it's a similar story, and that the data analysis and the AI and software behind there is very transparent and helpful to the logistics process. Increased investment into the autonomous shipping sector, so which is cheaper and more effective in pandemic conditions, so cargo drones and robotics. So they're definitely leading into those areas as well. And expect the airline industry to follow suit as they're cutting staff and issuing cost-cutting measures and shifting certain functions to digital, particularly around the boarding and check-in experiences. So airlines will have to work to bring back consumer confidence to travel, and that's going to be a very difficult task. It'll be a low priority for most consumers given the economic uncertainty as well as the social distancing fears. So we should expect health and social distancing measures to remain top of mind. We're already starting to see a lot of this tech insert itself into these areas. So we have like in customs and check-ins, but passengers will want less contact and assurance of their health. So pictured here, we have some biometric sensors that will become more of a mainstay. Etihad Airways is already trialing self-service tech that measures vitals and give a quick health overview. Delta has also rolled out biometric curb-to-gate experience, among others. What the industry is sort of saying and equating this to is what the world was like in post 9/11 and all of the measures and safety precautions that were developed as a result of that crises. Similarly, the airlines will react and innovate in a similar way. And that will continue into the cabin, where we can expect to see more innovation to occur in terms of cleaning processes, sanitation process. People will be reluctant to pack themselves into a crowded airplane without some precautionary measures. So maybe at first some certain empty seat policies or quarantine protocols will definitely be put in place for sick passengers, complimentary sanitation kits. But on the digital end of things, as purchasing and e-commerce continue to thrive, airlines would be wise to lean into this policy. And beyond the applications that already exist, perhaps there are additional shopping opportunities like duty-free and sky shopping that can capitalize here. So as we wrap up here on those areas and sections we talk about here at the lab is the idea of the next normal and what we predict to occur and the sorts of trends that we'll see in the future. So a greater adoption of digital platforms, an increase in automation and production, increased demand for micromobility, increased desire for autonomous vehicles, in the short term, a decreased demand for electric vehicles, and then also lean logistics to pivot to other types of production. We've come to the end here, and I will take one more moment to pause to see if there are any other questions from the last section that we could help answer.
Yes, we do have a question. Any thoughts on if COVID-19 could fast track drone delivery to mainstream adoption and set the stage for passenger drones in the future?
It certainly could. I think that there are still a lot of hurdles from what I've read in terms of getting drones into the mainstream, especially into the larger metropolitan areas. Again, that seems to be sort of a regulatory issue with air mapping and things like that. For now, I think that what's taking center stage are the delivery bots, but I could totally see the drones becoming more regular. I don't know, Adam, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, as a trend accelerator, I think there's going to be more investment in delivery drones in the near term. And as we try to figure out better ways to socially distance in the future, the autonomous vehicles for passenger transport have always been, I think a lot of the assumption was that they would be shared. And now there are, of course, some questions about being able to sterilize them between passengers and things like that. But I do expect that we're going to see a ton of research and development in the next few years about making public surfaces more sanitary in general. So maybe by the time that material science meets up with the sort of regulatory environment and capability for autonomous vehicles for passenger use, those might coincide and allow that to come to market a little earlier than expected as well.
Great, excellent. I hope that answered your question. If you do have any follow-ups, of course, you can feel free to reach out to myself or Adam here. But thank you so much again for joining us. We're very appreciative of your time. This whole presentation was pre-recorded and will be available to share out. If you have any follow-up questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to myself or Adam. We are still scheduling times to share these out with clients. So if you have any interest or you think any of this could be valuable to them, please let us know. It's a great way to provide that thought leadership and get them thinking outside of the box a bit. And we're also happy to customize that content for your individual client as well. I'm just going to give a little bit of a shameless plug because it's about to start, but IPG office hours are happening in just a couple minutes on Twitch with our partnerships team. You can find them on Twitch by searching IPG Lab. I think Adam's actually going to throw the link in our chat. It'll be a discussion with